March 1942, the North Atlantic. A British test pilot climbs into the cockpit of a twin-engine bomber on a windswept airfield in Pembrokeshire, Wales. The air smells of salt and aviation fuel. His breath fogs in the cold. He's here to test a new Rolls-Royce Merlin engine modification. Something about fuel mixture ratios and cruise efficiency. Routine work, paperwork, and gauges. He closes the canopy, runs through his checks, and pushes the throttle forward. The starboard engine roars to life. The port engine coughs, sputters, and dies. He tries again. Nothing. The propeller windmills uselessly in the slipstream. He's now flying on one engine over the gray, heaving Atlantic, 20 miles from shore. Protocol says return immediately. Abort the test. But he's a stubborn man, a product of RAF discipline and British economy. Fuel is rationed, flight time is precious, and the war effort cannot afford waste. So he makes a decision that will, in 3 months' time, rewrite the doctrine of anti-submarine warfare across 2 oceans. He keeps flying. At reduced power, barely holding altitude, he notices something strange. The aircraft is sluggish, mushing through the air at only 90 knots, a speed so slow that it borders on dangerous, hovering just above stall. But from his cockpit window, he sees the ocean below with a clarity he's never experienced before. The wave patterns, the color gradients, the way light bends through the water. And then, unmistakably, a shadow. Long, dark, and geometric. A submarine, running submerged at periscope depth, invisible to any aircraft traveling at normal speed, but perfectly visible to him, crawling through the sky at half throttle, one engine dead, breaking every rule in the manual. He doesn't know it yet, but he's just stumbled onto the solution to the greatest killer in the Atlantic. And it came from failure. By the spring of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had become a war of arithmetic and despair. German U-boats, operating in coordinated wolf packs, were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. In the first 4 months of that year alone, over 400 vessels went to the bottom. Tankers, freighters, troop transports, taking with them fuel, food, ammunition, and men. The convoys that supplied Britain, that kept the Soviet Union alive, that made any future invasion of Europe possible, were bleeding out into the cold water. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Not the Blitz, not the fall of France, the submarines. The Allies had tools. Radar was improving. Sonar existed. Depth charges could kill. But the fundamental problem remained: detection. A U-boat on the surface could be spotted by patrol aircraft, Sunderlands, Liberators, Catalinas, but by 1942, German captains had learned to dive at the first sound of engines. They'd run submerged during daylight, surface only, at night to recharge batteries and make speed. The window for aerial attack was vanishingly small. And even when a plane arrived on station, flying at cruising speed, 160, 180 knots, the ocean blurred into an unreadable mass of whitecaps and shadow. Submarines at periscope depth, just beneath the surface, were ghosts. Pilots knew this. They felt it in their bones. The frustration of flying patrol after patrol, burning fuel over empty sea while the kill counts climbed. They'd return to base, debrief, and hear the reports. Another convoy mauled, another tanker gone, another 30 men in the water. The U-boats weren't just winning. They were invisible. The RAF Coastal Command expected technology to solve this. Better radar, improved optics, lee lights for night attacks. They poured resources into equipment, into refinement, into incremental gains. What they didn't expect was that the answer would come from a test pilot's refusal to abort a failed engine trial. that it would come from flying wrong. Flight Lieutenant Cedric Masterman, the name is lost to some records, but the event is not, landed his crippled bomber 2 hours later and filed a terse incident report. Engine failure. Single engine return. Aircraft recovered. But he added a footnote, almost as an afterthought, a detail that most engineers would have dismissed. Observed submarine clearly visible at reduced airspeed. Recommend investigation. The report passed through channels. Most officers ignored it. Engine tests fail all the time. But one man, a wing commander named Humphrey de Verde Lee, an eccentric inventor already working on anti-submarine illumination systems, read it twice. He understood what Masterman had found. It wasn't the equipment that was blind. It was the speed. Lee ran the numbers. A coastal command patrol bomber, cruising at 160 knots, covers a mile of ocean every 22 seconds. The human eye, scanning from altitude, has less than 2 seconds to register an anomaly in any given patch of water before it's gone. A surfaced U-boat, black against the waves, might be visible. A submerged one, distorted by refraction, camouflaged by depth, impossible. But at 90 knots, at the speed Masterman had been forced into by his dead engine, the scan time doubles. The pilot's eye has time to register shape, shadow, the subtle discoloration of water displaced by a hull 30 feet down. The ocean stops being a blur. It becomes readable. Lee proposed an experiment. Take a squadron of patrol bombers and order them to fly their search patterns not at cruising speed, but at minimum controllable airspeed. Throttled back, flaps extended, barely above stall. The air crews thought he was insane. Flying that slow meant vulnerability. It meant longer exposure to anti-aircraft fire if the U-boat surfaced. It meant less range, less endurance, less coverage. It violated every instinct of aerial patrol doctrine, which prized speed and altitude as survival. But Coastal Command was desperate. In April 1942, they authorized trials. The first squadron to adopt the slow-speed search tactic was No. 172, flying Wellingtons out of Chivanor in North Devon. The crews hated it. The aircraft shuddered at low speed, controls mushy, stall warning buzzing constantly. Flight engineers had to recalculate fuel loads. Navigators had to replot patrol sectors. Pilots trained to trust speed as safety now had to trust the opposite. That vulnerability could be an advantage. That seeing was worth more than moving. For 2 weeks, they found nothing. The skeptics in command sharpened their knives. Then, on May 6th, a Wellington piloted by squadron leader James Lawrence, crawling over the Bay of Biscay at 85 knots, spotted a shadow. Dark, narrow, 30 feet below the surface. He called it in, dropped to attack altitude, and released 4 depth charges in a diamond pattern. The sea erupted, oil surfaced, debris followed. U-boat U-502, homeward bound from a patrol off Gibraltar, never made port. The confirmation took 3 days, but when it came, everything changed. Lee's heretical tactic, born from a failed engine test, from a pilot's stubbornness, from flying wrong, became doctrine. By June, every Coastal Command squadron in the Atlantic theater had been retrained. Cruise to station at normal speed. Once on patrol, throttle back. Fly slow. Fly low. See. The U-boat captains who had spent 2 years perfecting the art of the invisible approach suddenly found themselves exposed. Their periscope depth sanctuary, the safe zone between surface and deep dive, evaporated. They began to stay deeper, which reduced their effectiveness. They surfaced less, which drained their batteries faster. They made mistakes. The statistical record is brutal in its clarity. In the first quarter of 1942, before the slow-speed tactic, Coastal Command sank 17 U-boats in the Atlantic and Bay of Biscay. In the third quarter, after the tactic's adoption, they sank 41. the loss rate of merchant shipping dropped by 30%. Convoys that had been savaged in the winter months began arriving intact. The wolf packs, once untouchable, started hemorrhaging boats. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, wrote in his war diary in August, "Air cover has become intolerable, losses unsustainable. Recommend withdrawal from contested zones." Hitler refused. The submarines stayed. They died. By 1943, the slow-speed search, combined with improved radar and the closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap, had turned the Battle of the Atlantic. The Allies didn't just survive the U-boat threat, they broke it. The May of that year, Black May, the Germans called it, saw 43 U-boats sunk in a single month. Dönitz finally withdrew his fleet from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The war's outcome, in logistical terms, was no longer in doubt. Supplies flowed. Armies grew. The invasion became possible. And it had started with a sputtering engine over Wales, with a pilot who refused to abort, with a failure that revealed a truth no one had been looking for. But here is the deeper current beneath this story, the one that ran through every corner of the war where innovation met desperation. The German military, for all its early brilliance, for all its tactical genius and operational daring, had built its doctrine on certainty, on the perfection of the plan, on the assumption that the enemy would behave predictably, that technology would progress incrementally, that warfare could be controlled. The U-boat fleet was a masterpiece of engineering and strategy, but it was rigid. When Dönitz's captains encountered a new threat, they adapted slowly. Doctrine took weeks to revise. New tactics required approval from Berlin. The system, for all its efficiency, could not improvise. The Allies, by contrast, had learned to fail faster, to test, break, and rebuild. Coastal Command didn't authorize Lee's experiment because they believed it would work. They authorized it because they had nothing left to lose. The British war machine, by 1942, had been beaten, evacuated, bombed, and starved. It had no choice but to try the untried. To let a wing commander chase a test pilot's footnote. To let failure become data. And that willingness to turn a mistake into a tactic, to weaponize accident, to see opportunity in malfunction, was something the U-boat captains never understood until it was too late. They had been trained to execute plans. The Allies had been forced to invent them. There is an object that recurs in the memoirs of Coastal Command aircrews from this period, the thermos flask. British issue, battered metal, filled with tea before every patrol. It appears in almost every account, cradled in a navigator's lap during the long, cold hours over the Atlantic, passed between crew members during the monotonous sweeps, clutched in shaking hands after an attack run. It was a small thing, almost absurd in its domesticity, a piece of home carried into the machinery of war. But it represented something larger. The thermos was a symbol of endurance, of the belief that you could take a piece of ordinary life, warmth, comfort, routine, and carry it into the extraordinary, that you could fly for 8 hours in a freezing bomber, throttled back to stall speed, scanning an empty ocean for shadows, and still have your tea, still have that moment of normalcy. The Germans had their iron discipline, their engineered perfection. The British had tea at 10,000 feet. And somehow, improbably, the tea won. Because wars are not won by those who execute perfectly. They are won by those who endure imperfectly. By those who can take a failed engine test and see not disaster, but data. Who can look at a mistake and ask, what did this teach us? The slow-speed tactic was born from failure, refined through desperation, and sustained by the kind of stubborn, mundane resilience that a thermos of tea represents. The willingness to keep going, to keep looking, to believe that the next patrol, the next hour, the next pass over the gray water might be the one that matters. By the time the war ended, the slow-speed search had become so standard that most air crews didn't even know its origin. It was just how you hunted submarines. The story of Masterman's failed engine test faded into the footnotes, eclipsed by radar, by sonar, by the dramatic kills and the famous captains. But the pilots who had flown those early patrols, who had throttled back against every instinct and learned to see the invisible, they remembered. They knew what it had cost, the fuel, the time, the vulnerability, and they knew what it had won. In the end, the tactic saved an estimated 800 merchant vessels, 800 ships that would have gone down, that would have taken with them oil and steel and grain and men, but didn't. 800 ships that made it to port, that kept the convoys moving, that allowed the invasion fleet to assemble, that turned the arithmetic of the war. And it came from one man's refusal to abort, from flying wrong, from the kind of failure that, in the right hands, becomes something else entirely. March 1945. The North Atlantic, a young American pilot, newly assigned to a Navy patrol squadron, flies his first anti-submarine sweep in a Liberator out of Iceland. His instructor, a British liaison officer on loan from Coastal Command, sits beside him. They're over open water, throttled back to 90 knots, the aircraft shuddering in the cold air. The American is nervous. This feels wrong. Too slow. Too exposed. The British officer doesn't say much. He just points down at the water, at the way the light moves, at the patterns. He tells the American to stop thinking like a pilot and start thinking like a watcher, to trust the slowness, to let the ocean reveal itself. And then, after an hour of silence, he mentions a thermos, says he used to carry one back in '42 during the bad days, says it helped. Something about the ritual of it. The American doesn't really understand, but he nods. He keeps watching the water. Somewhere below, unseen, a U-boat changes course. It dives deeper. It survives the patrol, but it's the last time it will risk periscope depth in daylight. The ocean, once a sanctuary, has become a hunting ground. And the hunters learned their trade from a failed engine and a man who wouldn't quit. That is the legacy. Not the tonnage sunk or the medals earned, but the lesson that innovation often comes from accident. That doctrine can be rewritten by a footnote, and that the difference between defeat and victory sometimes hinges on a single choice: to abort, or to keep flying. To see failure as the end, or as the beginning of something no one planned for. The war taught many things, but perhaps the most important was this: the enemy who cannot adapt to failure will always lose to the enemy who can learn from it. And sometimes, learning means flying slower, looking harder, and trusting that the mistake you just made might be the answer you were looking for. The thermos stayed full. The patrols continued. The submarines, one by one, disappeared beneath the waves, not into safety, but into history. And the tactic born from a sputtering engine over Wales became the reason they never surfaced again.